In this video, we will take a closer look at what is perhaps the most interesting element of the conscious mind, the ego. We will identify its components, examine their functions, and determine the influence of the ego on the conscious mind. Let us now examine in greater detail what is perhaps the most fascinating element of the conscious mind, the ego. We will explore its components, their functions, and the influence the ego exerts on the conscious mind. The slide shown here presents the aspect of the ego's influence superimposed on the model of the conscious mind discussed in the previous video. Here we see an enlarged view of the individual components of the ego that influence its experiences and the decisions it makes. Within this model, we can distinguish the following components of the ego: the sphere of good, the sphere of evil, one's personal sense of justice, and the range of responses available to the ego. We will also introduce the concept of pride and lust. In this presentation, the term lust does not refer exclusively to sexual desire, but to every desire of the ego to satisfy its own wants. In the next slide, we will discuss the influence of propaganda, reaching the ego through the sphere of the world image. The sphere of good and the sphere of evil are associated with the influence of the spheres of thought and imagination, discussed in the previous video, upon the sphere of emotion, which has a direct effect on the ego's experiences. It should be recalled that, in this model, the sphere of emotion is understood to include all conscious states of the ego, including the experience of pain and the desires of the body originating from the sphere of the world image. For example, these include hunger and thirst. Thus, the term does not refer only to emotional states, in the sense of intense, difficult-to-control feelings such as anger or rage. Rather, it includes all emotional states, as well as desires, and others that directly influence the ego's actions. Through the influence of the sphere of the world image upon the spheres of thought, emotion, and imagination, experiences are aroused within the sphere of emotion that directly affect the ego. If these experiences affect the ego positively, they belong to the sphere of good. If they affect the ego negatively, they belong to the sphere of evil. Thus, to the sphere of evil, we may assign such emotions as offense, fear, humiliation, and a sense of inferiority. We shall also include in the sphere of evil unfulfilled desires such as anger, hatred, the desire for revenge, resentment, lust, frustration resulting from the failure to achieve a goal, or unrequited love. By the sphere of good, we shall mean those feelings that influence the ego in a positive way. For example, joy, love, pride, a sense of superiority, a sense of inferiority, for example in a religious context, but also the satisfaction of desires such as anger, hatred, the desire for revenge, lust, greed, ambition, achieving an intended goal, or having one's love reciprocated. In its search for its comfort zone, the ego is compelled to react in such a way as to minimize the influence of the sphere of evil and maximize the influence of the sphere of good. For this purpose, the reaction component, making use of its own sense of justice, carries out actions justified on the basis of the spheres of thought, imagination, and especially the experience of good or evil arising from the sphere of emotions. In other words, the actions of the ego are a reaction to the good or evil that directly affects it. They are motivated and justified by them. The more painful the evil or the more pleasant the good, the stronger and the more justified the reaction of the ego becomes in order to restore its state of comfort. The ego also acts preventively by avoiding situations in which evil may influence it or by increasing the possibility of the influence of good. An example of the ego's extreme dependence on the spheres of good and evil may be its reaction to intense pain, bodily injury, fear of pain, fear of bodily injury, or fear of death originating from the sphere of the image of the world. An example of an extremely strong dependence on the sphere of good may be the satisfaction of nicotine or alcohol cravings, as well as ordinary hunger or thirst. However, the most interesting aspects of the ego's spheres of the good and evil is the ego's inherent pride and its broadly understood lusts. In an age dominated by various evolutionary theories, one might use more neutral, milder terms, perhaps understood as needs and ambitions. However, if these characteristics are assumed to be evolutionary and therefore developmental in nature, then it can no longer even be claimed that their destructive influence is their primary characteristic. I will attempt to address their interpretation from the perspective of evolutionary theories in later videos, in the interest of a fair consideration of the arguments. Here, however, I have chosen to use the traditional pejorative terms, namely lust and pride, in order to demonstrate their harmful influence on the functioning of the conscious mind, which constitutes the thesis of this video. It is worth explaining, however, that by word pride we do not mean an excessive belief in one's own worth. We define it as an inherent and therefore inseparable characteristic of the conscious mind, consisting in a focus upon oneself and manifested in various ways as a strong desire to obtain personal benefits in the form of a strong sense of glory and dominance. Pride may manifest itself, for example, as ambition motivated by one's own glory, as a sense of superiority, a sense of inferiority, a sense of dignity, or a sense of pride arising, for example, from one's own achievements. The influence of pride upon the ego is so strong that as the ego's position in its own estimation increases, the ego does not admit to its pride. Indeed, it usually does not even recognize it, accepting this state as a normal and expressing it through its own sense of justice, which favors and justifies the actions of the ego, often giving rise to such feelings as anger, hatred, resentment, or a desire for revenge. Unlike the rather difficult to grasp concept of pride, the concept of lust can be defined briefly as a strong feeling of lack associated with the anticipated feeling of its satisfaction. Both pride and lust, such as greed, envy, the desire to possess, physical desire, and the pleasure derived from their satisfaction, increase as the position of the ego increases. The higher the position of the ego, the greater its opinion of itself becomes, and the greater its demands will be. In a greatly simplified sense, we may say that the conscious mind is a slave to the ego, dependent upon reacting to information and influences originating from the sphere of the world image, which evoke both negative and positive experiences in the ego. Based on the assumptions and models presented so far, let us now analyze the influence of the ego upon our actions in everyday life and, in a broader context, upon social relationships. In general, we may conclude that the recognition of good and evil is connected with recognizing with our conscious mind what is good or evil for us in the context of the ego's pride and lusts. Thus, in reality, following these experiences gives us an understanding of the direction toward gaining power over other minds, our surroundings, and the world, and also gives us an understanding of how to use that power for our own pleasure. As I mentioned earlier, as the ego acquires a higher position, that is, as the ego's lusts are satisfied within the spheres of good and evil, those lusts grow and become ready for ever greater pleasure in their satisfaction, which promotes the continual expansion of the ego's sphere of power. Thus, from the perspective of the personal benefits that the conscious mind gains by following the criterion of good and evil, it appears that both pride and lust may prove to be extremely useful. The problem, however, is that we are not the only mind, nor the greatest mind, guided by its own lusts. Other minds are guided by them as well, and therefore they may also seek to subordinate us to achieve that purpose. Much depends upon the position, that is, the power that we have managed to attain so far. Then we will satisfy our lusts within the limits of that power by making use of weaker minds that are subordinate to us, that is, minds possessing less power, but only on the condition that we allow ourselves to be used by minds possessing greater power in turn for the satisfaction of their lusts. Thus, a hierarchy of power is formed with dominators or a single dominator at the top governing the whole system. This hierarchy of power is based upon the morality of what is good and evil for oneself. Therefore, its structure may be changed by force at any moment. For this reason, those in power establish many safeguards to preserve it, especially legal safeguards, which I will return to at the end of this video. To make the exercise of power possible, the system of power must present the conscious mind with a vision of a comfort zone for the ego toward which it will strive. That is, a vision of glorious power in the case of a system of rewards, or a vision of survival in the case of a system of punishments. The necessary condition, however, is that the conscious mind believes in that vision. This role is fulfilled by propaganda, which in such a case must bear the appearance of truth. The function and role of propaganda are best illustrated by examples. In an extreme case, this could be a soldier who believes in the superiority of his nation as well as in his patriotic duty. It may be a member of caste who believes in his destiny, but it may also be an outstanding scientist who believes in the greatness of his future scientific achievements, in fame and in glory in the field of science. It may be a priest regarded as an outstanding moral authority and altruist, believing in his destiny with the glory of sainthood awaiting him either in his life or after death. It may be a businessman or any corporate employee who believes in an evolutionary view of the world, in progress through ruthless competition, in deriving pleasure from it, and in gaining status, women, and wealth. In all of these examples, they all, in reality, seek to belong to the elite of power in different fields, pursuing their own glory and various personal benefits. Glory in the sphere of morality, associated with values approved by society, is particularly deceptive. The conscious mind has no escape from pride. Even its apparent modesty and humility are forms of deceiving others and even deceiving itself. In reality, they are expressions of its convictions, of its own greatness and nobility. And glory is usually perceived by the ego through an overt or hidden sense of superiority, but also through the admiration of others, through respect, and sometimes through financial rewards. To summarize, the ego is the most deceitful, cunning, and devious entity dwelling within us, from which there is no escape. It adapts itself to every situation in order to achieve its comfort zone. It is the same ego that dwells in the mind of the ordinary worker, the respected altruist, and the hated general. But its goal is always the same: pride and lust. The ego is like a bull in the china shop. Wherever it appears, even unintentionally, it causes enormous damage for its own benefit. The ego is, in fact, incapable of defending even its own views, what it claims to believe, because it will always find an excuse and a justification for retreating into its comfort zone. The ego perfectly conceals its shortcomings from its own mind by claiming that those shortcomings does not exist. The ego treats exaggeration and boasting as a form of power over others, and thus as a means of manipulating them in order to receive glory from them and to receive credit for achievements in the form of a higher position and financial rewards. Only catching the ego in the very act gives rise to shame, because its magnificent image has collapsed. The system of power can manipulate the ego with extraordinary ease by promising something better or threatening something worse, in extreme cases perhaps even the ultimate end of its existence, thereby directing it toward its comfort zone. The ego, eager for prize, exaltation, and the benefits of satisfying its lusts, while at the same time being extremely sensitive to injury to its dignity and to humiliation, will direct the mind in precisely such a way as to satisfy its own demands. Thus, power over the conscious mind results from the possibility of manipulating it because of its complete inability to control pride and lusts, and especially because of its inability to control suffering, humiliation, the fear of bodily injury, and the fear of death. Manipulation consists in the appropriate application of these stimuli in order to compel behavior favorable to those in power by people who possess greater ability to exert influence or greater mental ability to achieve their goals. Unfortunately, there is no escape from this vicious circle of the struggle for power. You are either a ruler or a subordinate, determined by the struggle for power. Just as in a natural world, you are either a predator or a prey. Naturally, at the level of competition, these mechanisms compel workers to work and to produce more goods for those in power. Thus, this system is used deliberately and is beneficial mainly to the higher and highest level of power. For subordinate workers, it usually allows mere existence and under favorable conditions without damage to their health. So here we can see the operation of the genetic algorithm in its full form, where the so-called weaker individuals undergo selection and mate selection from the weaker gene pool. The strong individuals, on the other hand, the so-called elite, are usually those who are wealthy, educated, and possess power. They have the opportunity to choose from a better gene pool, for example among beautiful women, who are usually looking for precisely such opportunities. The far less controversial form of motivating subordinates is, of course, higher pay. However, in low-budget companies or companies that exploit their employees, especially where employees are highly dependent on the company, the only and the most effective form of motivation is, unfortunately, workplace bullying. It is a sad observation, but the greatest profits are made where human suffering is involved, that is, where the greatest needs exist. After all, the goal is to achieve the greatest possible profits, that is, to make the customer or the employee contribute as much as possible, while receiving as little as possible from us. In which profits for company owners are the greatest are medicine, the military, and banking. A person will give up everything for their health and safety. That, on the other hand, is a form of enslavement by the bank and the employer, for it compels people to take whatever actions are necessary to maintain a steady income. It makes it more difficult to undertake risky changes in situation of exploitation because of the risk of losing financial liquidity and seeing one's entire life collapse. Competition is won by those companies in which the employee is exploited to the greatest extent. That is why factories are moved to places where workers have fewer rights and are willing to work longer hours for lower pay. Profit maximization is achieved in factories where the worker's effort is maximized while wages are minimized. This is then referred to in business as increasing employee productivity. However, this comes at the cost of worsening the health and living conditions of workers. Typically, measures taken by those in power to increase employee productivity include unpaid working hours outside official records, contracts under the so-called task-based system, work overload, starvation wages, and above all, widespread workplace bullying for motivational purposes. The employer holds the superior position of power, so the only way to influence the employer is either to make the employer dependent on the employee or through some form of rebellion or a strike by a group of workers. In other words, it usually comes down to leverage, more or less honest and lawful, in the form of blackmail. Appealing to workers' rights by those who refuse to submit may end in persecution and the departure of the inconvenient employee. Thus, what will be the most desirable for everyone is to gain independence from the oppression of superior authority. For example, by gaining a certain degree of autonomy through merits in the eyes of those in power. This may be the role of a manager, supervisor, or director. or by quickly reaching the highest levels of power, usually through dishonest means, for example, by achieving outstanding results through exceptional oppression of subordinates or through the dishonest elimination of rivals. Rewarding subordinates, for example, not for diligence, honesty, and quality, but for loyalty and cunning, or even for actions harmful to customers in the name of greater profits. Another possibility is to attempt to separate oneself from the system of power. However, considering that the system of power controls the distribution of almost all wealth, for the seizure and distribution of resources is precisely the vital purpose of power, escaping from the system is always associated with the struggle for survival through independently producing resources and establishing one's own system of power. Of course, such an escape, together with the creation of resources and one's own system of power, may be met with suppression and absorption by a stronger competing system of power through physical force, financial power, or other instruments of coercion. One may also attempt to achieve a certain degree of independence from power through a modest lifestyle and savings that make one less vulnerable to its influence. However, such an attitude is associated with the conscious and lasting limitation of one's material ambitions. On the other hand, an attitude of even extreme stinginess may accompany people with a pathological fear of threats to the scope of their power, together with a tendency to make extreme use of subordinate power, and usually characterizes people at the higher level of power structures. Interestingly, it seems that the attitude most conducive to the enslavement of the conscious mind by the system of power is one of extravagance, living on credit and living in luxury. Therefore, such an attitude may certainly also characterize people within the structures of system of power that exploit the weaknesses of workers for slave-like labor or even for work requiring an immoral attitude. However, when we possess some exceptional scope of power, for example in the form of competence, attributes of beauty, in the case of women, or attributes of wealth, we then become an attractive target for power which would like to use us to satisfy its own goals, namely the lusts and pride of the ego. Especially when it is unable to offer conditions of cooperation appropriate to those competencies. A stark tyrant-slave relationship may then develop, functioning as a relationship of dependency in which the very attributes of the slave that may previously have been a source of pride can become the object of particular attack and be diminished in the slave's own eyes. On the other hand, a form of control may also be exercised over superior authority by making that authority dependent on the needs arising from its own lusts and pride. The more despotic power becomes, the more desirable it becomes as an object of manipulation. Therefore, the greater the need becomes to make it dependent on oneself, and the greater the excitement it may evoke. Such power relationships based on the ego may also arise in marriages or partnerships. In this bleak picture of power motivated by the ego's lusts and pride, it is worth mentioning at least one positive aspect of power in this film, namely its maintenance of order and legal regulations which, at least in theory, are intended to limit unfair competition for position of power and unfair competition in acquiring and producing resources. Legal regulations protecting systems of power, including private property, are essential for the fair development of a just distribution and the protection of resources.